3 days to lose a war began on July 1st, 1863, when two armies converged on Pennsylvania crossroads. Neither had intended to defend or attack, transforming sleepy market town of Gettysburg into battlefield where Confederate hopes for independence would be tested and broken. The encounter was accident of movement and miscommunication, cavalry screens that failed to provide intelligence, infantry columns that stumbled into each other while seeking supplies and maneuvering for advantage they could not achieve through planning that depended on information neither side possessed. A chance encounter transformed strategic situation as Confederate forces advancing through Pennsylvania without clear picture of Union positions made contact before either army was properly positioned or prepared for battle that would determine campaign's outcome and possibly war's trajectory. The thesis emerges clearly. Tiny choices cascade into catastrophe as commanders' decisions in heat of moment, based on incomplete information and influenced by fatigue and previous experiences, accumulated into pattern that doomed Confederate offensive that had begun with such promise just weeks earlier. The last best hope of Confederacy died at Gettysburg through series of mistakes that seemed reasonable or unavoidable to men making them, but that retrospective analysis reveals as compounding errors where each wrong decision made subsequent choices more difficult and disaster more likely. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was Confederate striking force capable of threatening northern cities and forcing political settlement, making its defeat not just tactical setback, but strategic catastrophe that shifted initiative permanently to Union forces. Tiny choices about where to position cavalry, when to attack hills, how to coordinate assaults across difficult terrain cascaded into 3 days of carnage that achieved nothing except demonstrating that Confederate military power could not overcome Union advantages in resources, position, and ultimately strategic patience that allowed defensive fighting that magnified Northern numerical superiority through geography that favored defenders. Lee advances into Pennsylvania with inadequate cavalry screening after Jeb Stuart rides wide on raid designed to gather supplies and intelligence, but that actually deprived Confederate Army of reconnaissance capability precisely when information about Union positions and movements was most critical. Stuart's absence left Confederate infantry marching blind through unfamiliar territory, unable to determine where enemy forces were concentrated or how quickly they could respond to Confederate movements that Stuart's cavalry should have monitored and reported. Confederate columns stumbled into contact without full picture of Union positions when advance units seeking supplies in Gettysburg encountered Union cavalry on June 30th and July 1st, triggering engagement that escalated as both sides committed reinforcements to developing battle neither had planned to fight at this location. The meeting engagement violated fundamental military principle that armies should choose battlefields deliberately rather than accepting combat wherever initial contact occurs, but circumstances of blind advance made planned battle impossible. Marching blind meant Confederate commanders made decisions based on immediate tactical situation visible from their positions rather than on strategic understanding of overall force dispositions and terrain that proper reconnaissance would have provided. Lee arrived at battlefield without knowing Union Army's full strength or positions, unable to determine whether concentration at Gettysburg represented main Union force or merely screening element that could be defeated before reinforcements arrived. The mistake was fundamental. Cavalry was eyes of army, and Stuart's absence meant Confederate forces were effectively blind during critical days when they needed intelligence most desperately. Without cavalry screen providing reliable information about enemy movements and positions, Confederate advance became groping operation, where commanders reacted to immediate threats without understanding broader situation that should have guided their strategic decisions about whether and where to accept major engagement. Union forces seized Cemetery Hill and high ground by nightfall on July 1st, after day of confused fighting where initial Confederate success in driving Union troops through town created false impression that victory was achievable through continued aggressive action. The retreating Union forces rallied on Cemetery Hill south of town, where arriving reinforcements and natural strength of position created defensive line that would anchor Union Army for next 2 days of battle. Terrain, not numbers, becomes Union's shield, as Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge provided elevated positions where artillery could dominate approaches and where defenders enjoyed advantage of firing downhill at attackers, crossing open ground under. Observation. The high ground was militarily significant, not because it was dramatically elevated, but because it provided clear fields of fire, allowed efficient movement of reserves along interior lines, and required attackers to assault uphill while exposed to defensive fire. The ground chooses army when terrain's natural advantages determine tactical possibilities and strategic outcomes more decisively than numerical superiority or tactical skill can overcome. Union possession of Cemetery Hill on evening of July 1st meant Confederates would fight next 2 days attacking positions that favored defenders, requiring assaults across difficult ground against entrenched troops, supported by artillery positioned to maximize defensive firepower. By nightfall, Union position was established strongly enough that dislodging them would require coordinated attacks against prepared defenses, fundamentally changing battle's character from meeting engagement, where neither side held advantages, to siege-style operation, where attackers faced disadvantages that their courage and tactical skill could not fully overcome. The high ground seizure by Union forces was consequence of Confederate failure to press attacks immediately after initial success, allowing beaten Union troops to rally on defensible terrain that they transformed into fortress during night of July 1st. Lee's ambiguous directive to Ewell to take Cemetery Hill, if practicable, collides with exhausted troops and urban chaos on evening of July 1st, when clear, decisive orders might have secured position before Union forces could establish strong defensive line. The conditional language gave Ewell discretion to assess situation and determine whether attack was feasible, effectively shifting decision from commanding general to subordinate commander, who lacked full picture of strategic situation and who naturally erred toward caution, given uncertainty about enemy strength and his own troops' condition. Orders built to fail created situation where responsibility for critical decision was unclear, where subordinate commander could justify inaction by citing exhaustion of troops and uncertainty about enemy positions, where opportunity for decisive action was lost through institutional caution that conditional orders encouraged. Minutes matter in warfare when enemy is disorganized and positions are not yet prepared, making immediate action potentially decisive, while delay allows enemy to recover and fortify. Ewell's assessment that assault was not practicable was reasonable. Given information available to him, his troops were exhausted from days fighting. Enemy strength on Cemetery Hill was unknown. Attacking through town's streets would be difficult and disorganized. But strategic opportunity required accepting risks that cautious tactical assessment counseled against, creating tension between prudent military judgment and aggressive action that opportunity demanded. The assault never comes as darkness falls and opportunity passes, with Confederate forces establishing positions north and east of Cemetery Hill, but not attempting to seize high ground, that Union forces were frantically fortifying through night. The lost hours allowed Union Army to concentrate forces, improve positions, and establish defensive line that would prove impossible to break during next 2 days of costly Confederate assaults against terrain that Union now controlled decisively. Those lost minutes harden into earthworks as Union troops arriving through night and early morning July 2nd transformed Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge into fortified positions, with artillery positioned to command approaches, infantry protected by stone walls and hastily constructed breastworks. Artillery hubs concentrated firepower at key points where Confederate attacks would be channeled by terrain, creating killing zones where attackers would face concentrated fire from multiple batteries supporting each other. Interior lines gave Union forces ability to move reserves quickly between threatened points along compact defensive position, allowing commanders to reinforce sectors under attack more rapidly than Confederate forces. Attacking from exterior positions could coordinate their assaults. The geometric advantage of interior lines meant Union troops could march shorter distances between positions than Confederate forces moving around exterior of defensive arc, multiplying Union defensive strength through efficient use of reserves. By dawn, on July 2nd, Union Center is impregnable, in sense that frontal assault against prepared positions would require attackers to cross open ground under artillery fire before engaging infantry protected by cover and elevation advantages. The fortress at dusk had become by morning defensive system, where every element supported others, where attackers would face sequential obstacles that channeled their advance into predetermined killing zones. The consequence of July 1st evening's lost opportunity was that Confederate Army would spend next 2 days attacking positions that could have been seized with moderate casualties during hours when Union forces were disorganized and defensive works did not yet exist. The transformation from vulnerable rallying point to fortified position occurred during night, while Confederate forces rested and reorganized, allowing Union commanders to establish defensive line that would cost thousands of Confederate lives to test unsuccessfully during subsequent attacks. Longstreet's lost morning on July 2nd resulted from disagreement between Lee and his most trusted corps commander about whether to attack Union positions or maneuver around Union flank to force battle on different terrain. Longstreet opposed daylight frontal battle against prepared positions, arguing for flanking movement that would compel Union forces to attack Confederate positions rather than requiring Confederate assaults against entrenched defenders enjoying terrain advantages. Disagreement and delay consumed morning hours as Lee insisted on attacking Union left flank while Longstreet reluctantly prepared assault he believed was tactically unsound and strategically unnecessary. The delays meant Confederate attack did not commence until afternoon, giving Union forces additional hours to strengthen positions and position reserves where they could respond to Confederate assault once it finally developed. Moves late and maneuvers under Union observation, as Longstreet's corps attempted to reach attack positions without being detected by Union signal stations on Little Round Top and Cemetery Hill. The movement was compromised when Confederate columns became visible to Union observers, eliminating surprise that might have allowed Confederates to strike unprepared positions before Union commanders could position reserves to meet threat. Surprise evaporates on July 2nd as Union commanders received warnings of Confederate preparations and shifted forces to threatened sectors, transforming what Lee hoped would be devastating surprise attack into frontal assault against prepared positions, where Union troops awaited Confederate advance with clear understanding of where attacks would fall. The lost morning and compromised movement meant Confederate assault struck positions that were as prepared as circumstances allowed, rather than catching Union forces unprepared for attack they did not expect. Confederate attacks slam into shifting Union reserves at Devil's Den, Wheatfield, and Little Round Top on afternoon of July 2nd in series of desperate struggles where terrain channeled assaults into narrow fronts and where Union commanders rushed reinforcements to threatened positions faster than Confederate forces, could exploit temporary advantages gained through local superiority and aggressive assaults. Piecemeal assaults burn lives for yards as Confederate brigades attacked sequentially rather than simultaneously, allowing Union forces to concentrate defensive fire against each attack in turn rather than being overwhelmed by coordinated assault that might have shattered defensive line through weight of simultaneous pressure at multiple points. The lack of coordination meant that Confederate numerical advantage in attacking sectors was negated by Union ability to shift reserves to meet each threat as it developed. The killing ground at Wheatfield changed hands multiple times during afternoon as Confederate attacks drove Union forces back, only to be counterattacked by Union reserves that Lee's forces could not match because Confederate reserves were committed to other sectors or were too distant to intervene quickly. The result was series of attacks and counterattacks that consumed brigades from both sides, while achieving nothing except demonstrating that neither side possessed decisive advantage in open combat, where terrain did not favor either army. Little Round Top's defense by hastily positioned Union troops under Colonel Chamberlain demonstrated how small unit actions could have strategic consequences when key terrain was at stake. The hill anchored Union left flank, and its loss would have compromised entire defensive position by allowing Confederate artillery to enfilade Union lines. Chamberlain's 20th Maine held against repeated Confederate assaults, preserving Union position through combination of desperate fighting and timely counterattack. that drove exhausted Confederate attackers from slopes they had nearly captured. Lee orders on echelon assaults on July 2nd, without synchronized timing mechanisms or clear map-based control that would allow coordinating attacks across several miles of front where different corps commanders could not observe each other's operations. An echelon attack theory called for sequential assaults, starting from one flank and rolling down line like falling dominoes, with each unit attacking as unit beside it made contact, creating continuous pressure that prevented enemy from concentrating reserves against any single threat. Attacking on enemy's clock meant Confederate assaults occurred according to Union Army's reaction times rather than Confederate planning, as delays and coordination failures caused units to attack out of phase with neighbors who were supposed to support them. The result was a series of isolated attacks that Union forces could defeat in detail by shifting reserves along interior lines faster than Confederate forces on exterior could coordinate their assaults. Corps attack out of phase as Longstreet's assault on Union left began hours before Ewell's diversionary attack on Union right, eliminating mutual support that simultaneous attacks might have provided by forcing Union commanders to divide attention and reserves between multiple simultaneous threats. Instead, Union commanders dealt with Longstreet's assault in afternoon, with full attention and all available reserves, before addressing Ewell's limited attacks on Culp's Hill later in evening. Squandering mass through poor coordination violated principle of war that required concentrating force at decisive point, dissipating Confederate numerical advantage in attacking sectors through temporal dispersion that allowed Union forces to achieve local superiority at each point of contact by moving reserves more quickly than Confederate exterior position allowed. The timing failures meant Confederate Army never achieved simultaneous pressure on Union lines that might have overwhelmed defensive capacity and broken position that isolated attacks merely tested without seriously threatening. With no unified punch, Union interior lines shuttle brigades to crisis points throughout July 2nd afternoon and evening, as commanders shifted reserves from quiet sectors to threatened positions faster than Confederate forces attacking from exterior positions could exploit local advantages they temporarily achieved. The geometric advantage of interior lines became a decisive factor as Union troops marched shorter distances to reach threatened sectors than Confederate reinforcements moving around exterior arc between attack positions. Confederate momentum bleeds away by the acre as initial successes in driving Union forces from advanced positions could not be exploited before Union reserves arrived to stabilize lines and counterattack exhausted Confederate units that had outrun their supports. Each Confederate success created salient that Union forces could attack from multiple directions, forcing Confederate commanders to commit reserves to holding gains rather than exploiting them for deeper penetrations of Union position. Strength fed into Grinder described Confederate experience on July 2nd as brigade after brigade was committed to attacks that gained limited ground at heavy cost, without achieving breakthrough that would have justified casualties or created opportunity for decisive exploitation. The pattern repeated across battlefield Confederate assault drives Union forces back, Union reserves counterattack, fighting stabilizes with Confederates holding slightly advanced positions that could not be developed into operational success. The consequence of uncoordinated attacks was that Confederate Army expended its offensive power in tactical actions that achieved nothing strategically, demonstrating that courage and tactical skill could not overcome fundamental disadvantages created by poor coordination and Union defensive advantages in terrain and interior lines. By evening of July 2nd, Confederate Army had suffered thousands of casualties, testing Union position without discovering weakness that could be exploited or creating conditions that might allow decisive attack next day. A massive preparatory bombardment on July 3rd was supposed to soften Union Center for Pickett's charge by destroying artillery batteries and disrupting infantry formations that Confederate assault would encounter during approach across open ground. Poor observation meant Confederate artillery could not accurately determine effects of bombardment because gunsmoke obscured targets and because Union batteries ceased firing to preserve ammunition, creating false impression that Confederate fire had been effective. Faulty fuses caused many Confederate shells to explode prematurely or pass over Union positions without detonating at optimal height for maximum fragmentation effect against exposed infantry and artillery crews. The result was bombardment that consumed Confederate ammunition reserves while achieving limited destruction of Union defensive positions that would receive Confederate assault. Artillery that couldn't break wall demonstrated limitations of Civil War artillery against prepared positions where defenders could seek cover behind earthworks and stone walls that absorbed shell fragments without collapsing. Union infantry lying prone behind Cemetery Ridge's crest were largely protected from Confederate artillery fire that passed overhead or burst too high to inflict casualties on troops who were not standing in formation. The Union line remains largely uncut after nearly 2 hours of bombardment that should have destroyed defensive positions and demoralized defenders. Union artillery had taken casualties, and ammunition expenditure was significant, but defensive lines' structural integrity was intact, with infantry formations ready to receive assault and sufficient artillery remaining to engage attackers during their approach across open ground. Wasting ammunition on ineffective bombardment meant Confederate forces lacked artillery support for actual assault because guns had expended rounds during preparatory fire that achieved little beyond announcing Confederate intentions and allowing Union forces to prepare for attack they knew was coming against positions bombardment had failed to materially weaken. 12,000 to 15,000 men cross open ground on July 3rd in assault that became known as Pickett's Charge, though it involved multiple divisions and was commanded by Longstreet, who opposed operation but executed Lee's orders, despite believing attack would fail. The Confederate formation advanced across 3/4 of a mile of open terrain under artillery fire that began as soon as assault emerged from tree line, protecting Confederate positions. Into unbroken guns meant Confederate infantry approached Union positions that still possessed adequate artillery and infantry strength to deliver devastating defensive fire against attackers who had no cover during approach and who were channeled by terrain into relatively narrow front, where Union forces could concentrate fire. The visual spectacle of thousands of men marching in formation toward enemy positions was tactically obsolete against rifle-musket range and artillery that could begin engaging targets at distances where attackers could not respond. The Confederate spear point shatters at the angle, where brief penetration of Union line by handful of Confederate troops under General Armistead was quickly contained and repulsed by Union reserves that sealed breach before it could be exploited. The high water mark of Confederacy became literal description, as Armistead's farthest advance represented maximum penetration that Confederate forces would ever achieve into Union-controlled territory. Becomes headstone for Confederate hopes as survivors retreated across same ground they had crossed, leaving thousands of casualties marking assault's path and demonstrating that courage could not overcome defensive advantages that made frontal assault against prepared positions suicidal. Lee's gamble that aggressive assault could break Union center despite all tactical disadvantages failed completely, ending Confederate offensive capability and forcing Army into defensive posture for retreat that would follow. Stuart's grand sweep aims to hit Union rear as Pickett goes in, creating dual threat that might have succeeded if cavalry assault had coordinated with infantry attack to divide Union attention and prevent reinforcement of threatened sectors. The plan required precise timing across several miles of terrain and perfect coordination between forces that could not communicate once operations commenced. But Stuart meets Union cavalry waiting under Brigadier General Gregg, who had positioned forces to intercept Confederate cavalry, attempting to reach Union rear areas where supply trains and headquarters were located. The cavalry battle 3 miles east of main infantry action was fierce engagement, where neither side achieved decisive advantage and where Stuart's force was blocked from reaching objectives that would have supported Pickett's assault. Timing and coordination fail as Stuart's attack occurred after Pickett's assault had already been repulsed, eliminating any possibility that dual threat would divide Union defensive attention or prevent concentration of reserves against Confederate infantry penetration. The cavalry where it counts least described, Stuart's position engaged in secondary action while missing from reconnaissance role, where his absence had contributed to Confederate strategic blindness throughout campaign. Cavalry's failure to reach Union rear meant Pickett's charge received no support from additional threat that might have prevented Union commanders from committing all available reserves to stopping infantry penetration. The result was that Confederate assault faced full weight of Union defensive power without diversionary actions that might have created opportunities for exploitation that unified assault could have achieved, but that isolated attack could, to not accomplish against prepared defenders who concentrated all attention on stopping single threat. With flank strike blunted and center wrecked, Lee has no remaining operational options for continuing offensive operations against Union Army that had repulsed every Confederate attack and that maintained strong defensive positions controlling key terrain. No door out meant Confederate Army could not achieve objectives that had brought it north, defeating Union Army decisively, threatening northern cities, forcing political settlement through military success that might have convinced northern public that continuing war was futile. The campaign's last gambit dies in dust and blood covering slopes of Cemetery Ridge, where thousands of Confederate casualties marked failed assault's path. Lee met survivors with admission that failure was his responsibility, attempting to encourage demoralized troops who had attacked courageously but who could not overcome tactical impossibilities that frontal assault against prepared positions created. Meade off the ridge could not be achieved through force available to Lee after 3 days of costly attacks had depleted Confederate combat power without achieving breakthroughs that might have justified casualties or created opportunities for continued offensive operations. Union position remained intact, with Army still capable of defensive operations and with morale strengthened by successful repulse of Confederate attacks that had tested but not broken Union lines. The consequence of 6 Confederate mistakes, inadequate cavalry reconnaissance, failure to seize high ground on July 1st, ambiguous orders, uncoordinated attacks, ineffective preparatory bombardment, and cavalry misemployment was cumulative disaster, where each error made subsequent decisions more difficult, and where combination of mistakes produced complete operational failure that ended Confederate offensive capability and forced retreat that would begin next day, under rain that turned roads to mud, and that symbolized Confederate hopes, drowning in recognition that invasion had failed completely. Retreat under rain and wrecked bridges begins on July 4th as Lee's army withdraws from Gettysburg, carrying thousands of wounded soldiers whose suffering during movement over rough roads in primitive ambulances and wagons added human tragedy to military defeat. The wounded wagons stretch for miles as Confederate medical services attempted to evacuate casualties who could not walk, creating vulnerable column that moved slowly through hostile territory where Union cavalry might have interdicted retreat and captured or destroyed significant portions of Lee's army. The Army of Northern Virginia survives through combination of Meade's caution in pursuit and Lee's skillful defensive positioning during withdrawal that discouraged Union attacks against Confederate rear guard. The army that reached Virginia was intact organizationally, though diminished in numbers and combat power, having lost roughly a third of its strength to casualties that could not be replaced from dwindling Confederate manpower reserves. But its aura of inevitability does not survive. Gettysburg's defeat, as psychological impact of failed invasion, destroyed Confederate confidence that had been built through 2 years of victories in Virginia, where Lee had consistently outmaneuvered Union commanders and won battles against superior forces. The defeat demonstrated that Confederate Army could be stopped when fighting on terrain that favored defenders and when Union forces were competently led and adequately supplied. The long road south represented more than physical movement. From Pennsylvania to Virginia, it marked transition from Confederate offensive operations designed to win war through decisive victories that might force Northern political. The settlement to defensive strategy aimed at prolonging conflict until Northern will to continue fighting collapsed. Gettysburg ended Confederate ability to threaten Northern territory seriously, forcing shift to defensive posture that would characterize remaining 2 years of war until Confederate collapse in spring 1865. How 72 Hours broke dream becomes clear when examining pattern of Confederate mistakes that transformed promising invasion into catastrophic defeat, costing army it could not afford to lose. Vague orders like Lee's directive to Ewell to take Cemetery Hill, if practicable, created ambiguity that subordinate commanders resolved through caution rather than aggression, missing opportunities that clear, decisive orders might have exploited. Bad reconnaissance resulting from Stuart's absence deprived Confederate Army of intelligence about Union positions and movements, precisely when information was most critical for making strategic decisions about where and whether to accept battle. Fractured timing of Confederate attacks on July 2nd meant assaults occurred sequentially rather than simultaneously, allowing Union forces to defeat each attack separately through efficient use of interior lines and reserves. Faith in valor over geometry characterized Lee's belief that aggressive assaults could overcome defensive advantages that terrain and prepared positions gave Union forces, leading to attacks like Pickett's Charge that asked Confederate soldiers to accomplish tactical impossibilities through courage that could not overcome mathematics of defensive firepower against exposed attackers crossing open ground. The Confederacy didn't just lose battle at Gettysburg, it lost war's initiative forever as defeat ended offensive capability and forced shift to defensive strategy that could only delay rather than prevent eventual Union victory. The cumulative effect of mistakes made during 3 days in July 1863 was to transform Confederate strategic position from potentially winning to inevitably losing, demonstrating how tactical errors can have strategic consequences that determine war's outcomes. Regardless of courage or tactical skill that soldiers displayed during battles, they could not win because commanders' decisions had made victory impossible before fighting even began. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.